It's time to start rallying around America's young conservatives and explore what it means to be a young Republican in the 21st century. In a world where it seems like everyone under 30 must be a liberal, these are the stories you haven't heard before from the voices of America's young conservatives. So let's find out what it truly means to be raised right. We are here on the Raised Right podcast with a very, very special guest this week. I'm so excited to bring on Kari Lake, who's an inspiration for me even before, my lawsuit incident happened. Always looked up to her and her career, and she's had quite the journey of her own. And I'm so excited to have her on the show just to kind of share that, from her perspective and hear it firsthand, because that's so important. So welcome, Kari.
Welcome. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And it was such a pleasure to meet you this week.
It was super great. Kari was the recipient of the very first Fearless and Free Award from the Arizona Women of Action. And she really is, like I said, an inspiration for all the women out there. Super, super great. So thank you again. Why don't you just kind of tell us how you, got into journalism, why you wanted that to be your career and how you got your start?
Well, I didn't know as a kid that I wanted to be a journalist. I actually didn't decide until I was already halfway through college that was really even a job I could consider. I'd originally planned to be an elementary education major, a school teacher like my father. And I kind of got into those courses and they were fine. It was some of the classes I had to take were great, but I wasn't really excited about it. So I continued along my course and I was paying my way through college and working, and I ran out of money. And so I quit college for a couple of years. And during that time, I went and worked at a radio station selling radio ads. And the radio station was connected to the television station. So, occasionally in the break room, you'd see one of the reporters or anchors from the TV station come in to get, something from the vending machine. And that was the first time I thought, wow, there's actually jobs out there in TV. That would be kind of interesting. But I wasn't a big news consumer at the time. When I was growing up, my parents didn't allow us to watch much television except on like Saturday nights. That was it. So I didn't watch a lot of news. And during my 2 years where I quit my college education, I ended up moving in with my sister, whose husband was a real news junkie. I mean, he had the news on 24/7, and this is before 24/7 news, but he had the morning Today show on, and he watched the local news, and he watched the noon news and the 5 p.m. news. So it was kind of interesting how he was so excited about watching television news. And because I lived there, I watched a lot of news with him. So shortly after that, I decided to go back and finish my degree and talked to my college counselor and said, I kind of want to do this job. Is there a path for me? And she kind of walked me through that and took some journalism classes, took some production classes, and got a bunch of internships. I had, at one point, had 3 unpaid internships while I was going to college and taking a full load. It was intense, but once I decided that's what I wanted to do, and I had the passion and desire to do it, I was on a full bore, you can't stop me course to make it happen. And I landed my first job in a TV station before I graduated from college.
Wow, that's great. That was quite the journey then. That's so exciting. So you've had this career for 30 years and then, got to see a lot of really cool things that you got to do. What were some of the highlights and your favorites from that 30-year career?
Well, let me start off with the low light. I'm going to start off with when I first got on the air, because most people weren't good when they first got on the air. And I remember my very first time on the air, I worked for, I told you I had a job before I graduated from college, and I was working behind the scenes. Of course, I wanted to be a reporter, and everybody who worked behind the scenes would show up in, jeans and sweatshirts and t-shirts. But I thought, well, if I wanted to get a chance at making my way as a reporter, I need to dress the part, at least try to be presentable in case I were to be sent out on a story. And sure enough, once I mastered the behind the scenes work, I would get it done early and go to the assignment editor and say, if you need me for anything, I'll go out. I can go out with the photographer and ask the questions and bring it back and put it together. So I did that for a few months. Never got on the air, but worked really, really hard at it. And then eventually got my big break when they were short staffed and somebody called in sick. I got my first piece on the air. And that was just enough to put a resume tape together and get a job across town, which in my case was actually, it was a Mississippi River town. So it was across the river. And I got my first on-air job at the lowest rated station in town. And my very first time on the air, they had me doing weather, and I didn't plan for as much time as I needed to make it to the set, put my microphone on, get settled. So I was running to the set for my very first on-air appearance live. And I was out of breath, huffing and puffing, and could barely make it through my very first weather cast. So my first time on the air was such a stressful low light that I learned always become prepared, get there in plenty of time. Don't ever, slide into the set and expect to go on the air. Try to have a little more preparation behind it. So I got better from there, thankfully.
No, I love that.
But I was hyperventilating through my first 3 minutes of live television, full on hyperventilating. So I guess the reason I tell you that story, it goes up from there. It gets better.
Right. I think that's the experience, a lot of people have, is it's never what it's cracked up to be right at first. But once you put the work in, it tends to work out and have some good experiences with it. So when I, heard you speak, I had understood your decision and your story to leave. I had watched your video announcement and everything, but was so honored to get to hear it from your perspective and your firsthand account of everything. So why don't you kind of walk our audience through that same story of, having this great career, really loving what you were doing, and then making the tough decision to step away from something like that.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed my career. And when you're working in news, you get to experience so many amazing things, from interviewing people who you always admired and they come through town and you do an interview with them, and that's exciting and you get to know them a little better, to talking to lawmakers and athletes and people of influence in your community. So I always enjoyed that. And I just look at everybody as a regular person, which they are. But it was always cool to be able to cover the big events when a big news story happened, to be kind of in the middle of it and telling people what was happening. So I enjoyed so much of my career, from covering people in Hollywood to going to the White House a couple of times. I have had 3 exclusive interviews with sitting US presidents. So that was exciting and a highlight. But this last year, covering COVID, of course, a lot of people at various TV stations around town and around the country went home to become broadcasters from home, because the concern was that if the virus were to make its way through a newsroom or a news outlet, then they wouldn't be able to go on the air, and you always have to be able to go on the air. And so a lot of people, the majority of people, moved home and broadcast from home, and we'd have a few people staying at the station as well. And this happened across the country in all media. And I think it was during my time working from home that I really noticed in all media, we were covering COVID. Initially, it was very, very scary. We were all frightened by it. But as little pieces of good news would start to come out, or a doctor would say, hey, look, I'm having some success here with this treatment, or why don't we try this? It just seemed like there was no interest in covering that. It was covering the numbers, the COVID numbers, the number of cases, without any context as to what that meant. And for so many of those cases, it was just people who had tested because they had to for some reason or another. They weren't in the hospital. As a matter of fact, some of them were perfectly fine. They had very few symptoms. And we know that about 99% of people recovered fully. Obviously, some had severe symptoms and some had mild symptoms, but we were constantly pushing those kind of numbers across the board in the media. And hospital beds are full. There's no room at the ICU. And we didn't give it any context. Here we're in Maricopa County. We're in the fastest growing county in the country. And it's cold and flu season. So the hospitals usually fill up during cold and flu season, because hospitals they aren't built to sit at low capacity or low occupancy, I guess you could say. And having a son who's asthmatic, we've been in the hospital almost every year during cold and flu season. And many years before COVID, we would see the hospitals were full, and sometimes they'd have to double up people in rooms or open up an area of the hospital that had previously been mothballed. So that's not so rare. It wasn't as if, wow, we're not going to have room for you. You're going to have to suffer without any care. And I really started to feel that we were trying to scare people, that the effort and the work the media was putting in to covering COVID was meant to scare and divide people and have them living in fear rather than to give them any hope. And I also, over the past couple of years, have noticed in how the media fills its time. It's not so much, Rae'Lee, what you see on the screen when you're watching an hour-long program. It's what you don't see. Why are certain stories not covered and certain stories are always covered? Why are the stories that maybe paint police officers in a bad light covered ad nauseum, and very rarely would you see a story where a police officer is doing good covered or given much attention? So it just seems like a lot of division, and it was starting to feel like it was intentional. I didn't want to be part of that.
Absolutely. I think that is something that a lot of people have to think about and are faced with, including myself. I was a journalism major who kind of stepped into a world where it wasn't what I thought it was going to be at all. And I know there's a lot of students out there that feel the same way and are just scared and don't know what to do, because what they thought, maybe the career would look like and would be isn't necessarily the way that their education or experience has been going. So what would your advice be, as someone who made this decision, be to someone who might be struggling with that as well?
Oh boy, it's interesting because my daughter has recently, she's starting to look at her future in college, and she's thought about going into journalism. It's crossed her mind because she's seen me enjoy my career for the most part. And I'm trying to encourage her maybe to try a different path because of the state of journalism. When I was in school and in my journalism classes, it was the who, what, where, when, why. Your opinion doesn't matter, and your politics definitely shouldn't be part of it. And it seems like, I don't know how they're teaching it now because I haven't been in college for a number of years, but it seems like they're teaching young journalists to have an activism angle. And I actually would ask you that because you were in journalism school. Are they pushing people not to show their opinion, not to get political, and not to cover a story with a bent or an angle to it?
Yeah, and that's something that we talk, a lot about, is trying not to have an opinion or push any side. But then you do see this kind of unfair approach and consequences to certain demographics that may do that, and get free pass and get all the praise for it, and then a different side that doesn't at all. It gets heavily punished and faces consequence for doing that. So it's really muddy water. And I think the element of social media makes that even worse. We see all these journalists with retweets don't equal endorsements and thoughts are my own. And it's just it's a tough time being a journalist and covering the news when, sometimes you get pulled into it and you become the news, which is never what you want to do or expect to happen, but it does.
And I think it's really hard if you're conservative, and I'm conservative, and in newsrooms, most newsrooms in the corporate media, I would say it's 90 to 95% liberal or liberal leaning staff. And we all have our opinions, that's for sure. We all have our ideology. We have experiences that lead us to believe that way that we believe. But when you have such a lopsided makeup of staff where it's 90 to 95% liberal and 5% conservative, and conservatives in newsrooms, and I heard from a lot of them after I resigned, conservatives in newsrooms, even though they're there, they don't feel free to share their opinion, or not even opinion, that might be a little bit more on the conservative side or deal with traditional values. They're just not welcome. So even though there are a few conservatives in newsrooms, I believe that they feel that they are silenced and really pushed to the sideline. So almost like, hey, keep it quiet or you won't be able to keep your job. I'm thinking that people feel that way if they're conservative in a newsroom. It's not a very welcoming atmosphere.
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I was the one that wouldn't keep quiet, and I did lose my job over it. And so it's a very tough world to navigate. And I wanted to ask you, from your experience, has a newsroom always kind of been that way, or is it something that happened more recently? I mean, how did newsrooms get to this state?
how did they devolve? I
Yeah.
would say evolve, but I don't think it's been an act of evolution. I think it's been
Right.
devolving. Actually, I think it's very strange. The Donald Trump coming into office is when I really noticed people start to lose it and lose their mind. It was like, whoa, okay, people, we have a new candidate. He's not the establishment candidate, but that's what politics is about. Anybody can run, right? You don't have to be crowned the winner. You can run for office in this country. We, the people, right? We can run for office. And it just, I started noticing everybody really losing their mind over it. And at first it was kind of a novelty. It was like, oh, this is going to make for an interesting election. But it quickly turned into, I think they call it Trump derangement syndrome. And it just got progressively worse. And it somewhere along the way, it became okay to just openly bash a candidate and then obviously a president when he was elected. And somewhere along the way, it just became so commonplace and normal for that to happen that the people who weren't doing that, I think, were singled out. And I was somebody who didn't feel it was the right thing to do to attack and unnecessarily the president. So I think I was kind of labeled as, oh, you must be a Trump supporter, you must be a conservative. And once you kind of get labeled that way, even though I really get along with everybody I work with, and I think other conservatives feel this way across the media, once you kind of get labeled as somebody who's not going with what everybody else is doing, you're not standing in line and getting in line with everybody else, then you are on the outs. But I think Donald Trump really set the news media and journalism over the edge. They just sent him like straight down over the cliff.
Right. Right. And do you think, in the long run, is that going to be for a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, obviously now it's not great, but the long-term ramifications of that, what are your thoughts on?
One other thing I should mention, I think the newsroom composition also is very young, and that's wonderful. We want young ideas. I mean, I look at you, you have such great energy, you're very intelligent, but along the way, and maybe it's because salaries have changed and maybe because people who were a little more traditional, valued type people or conservatives didn't feel that it was a welcoming place working in the media, they've left. So we're losing a lot of the older people who had many, many years of experience as journalists in newsrooms. The composition is much younger, fresh out of journalism school. And so you're just going to get different priorities and different ideas. And the younger kids coming out of college and all of a sudden they're calling the shots and they're saying, we're going to put these stories in because these are the stories that matter to us, without maybe looking at, well, what matters to the viewer at home, who's a little bit older perhaps, or maybe they are conservative, maybe they have traditional values. And when you stop covering stories that interest them or that affect their lives, they just tune out. And pretty soon you're left with very few people watching. And that, I think, will be the demise of journalism and media. I think so few people will be watching that they won't be able to pay their bills. I mean, that's kind of how I believe it will come to an end.
Right. Wow. And that's very powerful. So next question, kind of a two-pronged question. You've already answered a little bit with that last response, but what would you say, looking at it now, is going to be the future of journalism, and what can we as the up and coming generation do to kind of turn it around and get it back to what it was supposed to be, of a truthful linkage institution?
I think there are some really great alternative journalism sites that are popping up, and you have to really dig around to find them. I mean, we've gotten so used, at least in my life, to the big networks, the CNNs, the MSNBC, the CBS, ABC, you got used to those big ones. And now there's a lot of smaller ones that are popping up. I think of John Solomon's Just the News. I think of Cheryl Atkinson. She does great journalism. So they're out there. They're really good journalists who have left the mainstream media or the corporate media, as you hear it referred to, and they're starting their own honest journalism sites. So I think they are popping up, and those are going to be really powerful. You don't need to have a broadcast network behind you to put out good journalism. I think of Project Veritas, they've broken so many stories, really impactful journalism. And of course, the New York Times laughs them off, and CNN and all of that, but they've actually been making news and doing true journalism. So I think we're going to see a growth in that. We're going to see the big networks suffer, and some of them may go under. I mean, I don't know how CNN pays the bills sometimes when you think of how low the ratings have gone, but that's what it's going to have to come to. People are just going to have to say, look, I'm not going to give you my attention because you are not ethical. I'm not going to give you my attention. They're all vying for the public's attention. You know, you have 24 hours in the day. How much of it are you going to give to a news outlet that's not ethical or that's proven to be biased? Well, once people stop giving their attention to these networks, I don't think they can survive. Kind of like, I think there was a boycott recently after Georgia passed some voting laws and Coca-Cola said, hey, we're not going to, or, you know, they were critical of it. And people said, okay, well, we're not going to buy Coca-Cola then. So you see that kind of thing happening, and people just start to go after these woke corporations. And when they hold back their money or their time and attention, that's when I think they get the message.
So how was the response to your decision then? Was it positive? Was it negative? Was it, a lot to take in?
It was amazing. I had no idea, Rae'Lee, that putting that video out. I mean, I just wanted to let the viewers know who've been following me all these years, and the wonderful viewers here in Arizona, that I wasn't going to be on TV anymore. And I also wanted to let them know, I just didn't want to disappear and say I'm resigning. I wanted to tell them why. And I uploaded that video at about midnight, the day that I resigned, and went to sleep. And I woke up, 6 hours later, and my phone, it was almost hot to the touch. I had so many text messages. They were just like coming in as I was trying to read them. More would come in. And first few days, I had hundreds and hundreds of emails, really the first full week. And then I'm still getting emails from people who are seeing it all over the world. It's crazy. That video has been replayed and shared and all of that. So it's all been positive. People are stopping me. I was walking down the street the other day with my husband. We were on a walk, and somebody pulled up, the car drove by, and then they stopped, and then they reversed and they came right up beside us and said, oh my gosh, you don't realize how much of an impact that made on me. It makes me want to stand up for what I believe and stop self-censoring myself and, allowing people to cancel me or speak down to me at work because I'm a conservative. I'm not going to do that anymore. We need to stand up for what's right in this country and not allow ourselves to be trampled over by the mob and the cancel culture. So, anytime you can inspire someone, that feels so good. And I do believe that courage is contagious, that once you see a courageous act, you're more inspired to behave that way. And I think if we could all really think about the actions we're making, and even if you're on the left and you find yourself online with somebody getting into it, just have respect for people who have a differing opinion and realize that they care deeply about this country. So I'm excited that people feel moved now to stand up and do something big and not be a victim of the mob, which is we're all sick of. I think even people on the left might be sick of the cancel mob.
Absolutely. Yes. And you 100% embody that fearless and free energy that we need in this country of just being bold and true in our beliefs. That's really, I think, powerful and what our country needs more than anything right now. So thank you for inspiring me and hundreds of millions of people out there.
Well, and vice versa, because you inspired me. I mean, you always think you look up to people or mentors or people that you really aspire to be like, and they're older. But I look at your story and I get the goosebumps just thinking about it, that you stood up and did what was right. And I know when you spoke the other night at that event that we were at, you talked about how scary it is when you're canceled. That first time you're canceled, and I've been canceled, unfortunately, several times. Once the media gets onto you that you're a conservative, even though I never put that out on the air, they want to go after you. And I always said, I don't think they really wanted to go after me. I think they wanted to make an example of me so that anybody else, that other 5% in the media, would know, hey, but they were trying to say is you better sit down and shut up and don't push anything that would be conservative, or we will cancel you as well. Right. So I think they were making an example. But you mentioned it, that first time you're canceled, it's so scary. And, it's not a fun place to be. You kind of feel like, oh my gosh, my world's kind of caving in on me. Mm-hmm. But then, with a little bit of time, you realize, look, I didn't do anything wrong. This is what they're doing is wrong. And you kind of just every hour gain a little bit more confidence to just say, okay, what are my choices here? I got to stand up, I got to fight on, and I got to keep going.
Right. Absolutely. So true. When you fight for truth, good prevails. When you walk with God, good wins. So
I
hopefully we
agree.
can encourage other people out there that find themselves in similar situations to do the same. I think that's very important. So thank you so much, Kari, for your time. I appreciate you taking it to come on the show and share your story with us.
Thank you, Rae'Lee. I really appreciate it and hope to see you again soon.
Enjoy this episode of Raised Right? Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app to catch the next episode. And be sure to like and follow us on Instagram at Raised Right Podcast and Facebook and Twitter at Raised Right Pod.